Chapter 7 of Fact Stranger Than Fiction by John Patterson Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Back to Cleveland. In the city of Fayetteville we found ourselves in the midst of many relatives and warm-hearted friends, two of whom most highly prized by us were Mr. A. J. Chestnut, father of Charles W. Chestnut, Esquire, author and scholar, whose name I have mentioned heretofore, and the other was the late Mrs. Sophia Carter, a sister of Mr. A. J. Chestnut, who temporarily, in a motherly way, received my dear wife, and made her comfortable and happy as long as we remained there. We left with Mrs. Carter a cook stove, rara vie, in that part of the country, condition that when convenient she should remit to us the sum of $15, the purchase price of the same. Of this transaction more anon. Arriving in Cleveland after spending a month as the guest of my dear mother and sisters, we rented a suite of 2 rooms on the second floor of a frame dwelling house still standing in Brownell Street, now East 14th, furnished it at an expense of $27, and moved into it. It was now near winter, and the remainder of cash which I had brought with me from Bennettsville had dwindled down to a negligible amount, and as I was not known in Cleveland as a lawyer, I began to have visions of the gaunt finger of want. Under these conditions, the late R. L. Holden and I planned and executed a tour of some of the prominent cities of the East, including some of those which I had visited in my school days when I sold my little book and lectured. During this tour we acted in a dual capacity, I lecturing first and Holden following with some side-splitting stories. We were well treated and received enough money to defray all expenses, but little more, and on my return to my wife and 2 babies now, I found myself in the most dire strait financially I had ever been in before, even more so than when I took that midnight trip to Laurinburg, for then I had no rent to pay on the spot, and I had only 1 baby to care for. Moreover, I could see flitting around and past me youths and men of my acquaintance who had never orated in public, and whose names had never been blazed forth as an orator, hero, lawyer, and what not, yet sleek and well clad, still acting in the role of waiters and menials, while I was almost hungry and naked. I was out of coal, with the mercury at almost zero, my rent was in arrears, with no prospect of payment, and the larder was well nigh empty. In this plight Mr. Cicero M. Richardson, one of the foremost and well-to-do citizens of color, kindly sent me a few bushels of coal, and none too soon. Another dear good friend, Mr. James Thompson, a Roman Catholic, small in stature and very dark, visited me and gave me of his advice and assistance, a favor which later on I repaid in kind, of which he never knew. I went out into the city amongst several of my erstwhile colored friends, and tried to persuade them to loan me the sum of $5, but in vain. I regret to say they proved to be in a worse financial condition than I myself was, provided they told me the truth. I then went to Mr. Byron Hunt, a white man, clerk at the old Birch House, where I worked for my meals during a part of my school days. He loaned it to me without hesitation, and I afterwards returned it to him. I went to a grocery store around the corner of East 14th Street, Brownell, and Prospect Street, and filled my basket with groceries one morning, but not having money sufficient to pay the bill in full, I handed him back the butter. Arriving at home, we ate our bread without butter, which I had often done before. Frequently I attended the police court, hoping against fate that somebody of all would retain me to defend him, but in vain. What knowledge had they of my legal ability, or the contrary? None at all. Some of them perchance had heard of me as being an apt and successful schoolboy, and that I had been graduated from the law college, but the report of my signal success at the South Carolina bar had not reached them, and when the life, liberty, or property of a man is at stake, he wants the best and most influential lawyer he can obtain. But let Hercules do as he may, the cat will mew and the dog will have his day. And my day finally came when a young colored man, J. A. Hawkins by name, long since deceased, who was unjustly accused of an offense, seeing me in the court room, came to me and gave me a retainer of $25 to defend him. To say I was pleased, and only mildly expresses the sensation which nearly overwhelmed me, not more by reason of the retainer than because it would give me an opportunity of being seen and heard in that legal arena, where I was destined for so many long years to strut and fret and contend as an advocate of justice between man, and the state of Ohio, and the defendant at the bar. Mr. Hawkins was speedily acquitted, and went from the presence of the court without delay to blazon forth my merits as a lawyer, and thereby assist me in securing my daily bread, butter or no butter. It was a peculiar coincidence that just before Mr. Hawkins retained me, when I was once more dead broke, I received a letter from that dear Mrs. Sophia Carter, enclosing 3 $5 bills, in payment of the little cook stove which we had placed in her possession on leaving Fayetteville. Truly for us, I could say with Romeo, night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops. We had now $40 in cash at our disposal, and I was determined to make the most of it, and from that time down to the present day we have been above sheer want, and at times able to cast a little bread on the waters. The advent of the municipal election drew near. A mayor was to be elected, and various and sundry municipal officials, including a number of justices of the peace, to serve the township and city of Cleveland during the ensuing 3 years. In that contingency, to my great surprise and gratification, uprose Pard B. Smith, sheriff of Cuyahoga County, Ohio, William T. Clark, Esquire, attorney at law, in whose office I had my desk, and Johnny Francisco, highly esteemed, veteran of the Civil War, and in the convention they wrought so manfully and successfully that I received the nomination for Justice of the Peace at the hands of the Republican party. At the same time, John Huntington, Esquire, was nominated for mayor. When the votes were counted on the night of the first Monday in April, 1873, the results proved that Mr. Huntington was defeated by more than 1,200, while this writer was elected by more than 3,000 majority. This was the first instance within my memory of the election of a colored man to any office in the state of Ohio, and to the best of my knowledge the first time a colored man was elected to a judicial office in the great North, East, and West. In the former slave states, where the colored voters, assisted by a few white men, were in the majority, and members of the race who could neither read nor write were in some instances elected even to the law-making branch, it was different. When I attended a state convention in Columbia, South Carolina, I met and associated with Justice Wright, a pure Negro, who was an associate justice of the Supreme Court of that august state, the home of the Rhetts, the Barnwells, and of John C. Calhoun, of senatorial fame. I rented the office and succeeded to the judicial functions of the late General David L. Wood, and thereafter, for 9 consecutive years by re-elections, I remained one of the justices of the peace of this populous, wealthy, and intelligent city of Cleveland, Ohio. In order that the significance of my promotion may be fully appreciated, it may be recorded that the bond required of a justice was $5,000, which would be equal to $10,000 now. My bond was signed on the several occasions by the late W. C. McFarland, the same attorney whose office I cared for when I was in the Law College in 1869. An able, kind, and generous man was Mr. McFarland, and in his death the Cleveland bar sustained a real loss. Justices of the peace at that time had in civil cases jurisdiction to the amount of $300, exclusive jurisdiction in forcible entry and detainer cases, and examining powers in all felonies and misdemeanors from murder down, which made the Court of Justice of the Peace of more importance than that of municipal judge in Washington, D.C., or elsewhere at that time. Moreover, it was an elective office by a majority of the votes of the people, which I have always considered the most honorable way of obtaining office, no matter of what importance. Amongst the conspicuous lawyers who appeared in my court and transacted legal business may be mentioned ex-Senator Theodore E. Burton, who informed me when he was a notable candidate for the presidency that he tried his first case in my court. Mr. Andrew Squire, who at that time was a youthful practitioner, also tried cases before me, as did the late Virgil P. Klein, R. E. Mix, C. W. Noble, and Mr. John G. White, now famous as a jurist. Thomas J. Curran, John J. Curran, and Mr. William Heisley, all able attorneys, gave me business and appeared in my justice's court. A long list would be required to contain all the names of those attorneys, living and dead, who honored me with their business and presence. The Honorable Myron T. Herrick, ex-governor of Ohio and ex-U.S. ambassador to France, says to me in a postscript to a nice letter, "I recall that you were one of my first friends when, as a young man, I was admitted to the bar." Johnny McGraw, C.R. Heller, and James Sweeney, the first and third of Irish descent, were two of my constables, while Parker Hare, L.W. Turner, and J.H. Washington, all colored men, were at times in my office. Parker Hare for 5 consecutive years. While I was serving my second term as Justice of the Peace in 1877, I was nominated by the Republican Party of Cuyahoga County for the lower branch of the General Assembly of Ohio. The canvass was long and at times exciting. I stumped the whole county and tried to meet the objections of a colored man, now deceased, Madison Telly by name, residing in the Haymarket district, who was favoring the Democratic ticket and boasted that he would defeat me. There was another man, White Wilson Treat by name, who resided in the old 11th Ward on the west side of the river, who quite effectively opposed me, because when he was in his cups he squeezed one of my hands until small beads of blood oozed from the roots of 2 of my fingernails, and I then and there insulted him by telling him what I thought of him, which was not flattering by any means. The next morning after the election I was declared elected by 62 majority over the late John C. Covert, at that time one of the editors of the Cleveland Leader. The late Edwin Cowles, who with the late Joseph Medill of the Chicago Tribune founded the Leader and for many years made it a great power for the abolition of slavery, the preservation of our glorious Union, and a true wholesome Americanism, was emeritus then while young men were at the helm. My election was blazoned forth with big headlines in all the daily papers. Great was the consternation of the friends and supporters of Mr. Covert. They had run him as a champion of the demand that all church property should be taxed, thereby to inflict a telling, if not mortal, blow on the Roman Catholic Church in Ohio. Another night passed when an alleged recount of the ballots cast for me was had in Old Ward No. 4, which had its headquarters in the engine house, still standing in East 18th Street, then Huntington Street, near Central Avenue. The result of the recount, as announced on the following morning, was that they had thrown out 84 votes previously counted for me, because they could not determine whether they were intended for me or for F.W. Green, one of the nominees on the Democratic ticket. Thus they declared me defeated, and John C. Covert was declared elected by a small majority, and he was subsequently reelected and served 4 years as a lawmaker of the great state of Ohio. But as far as I can see, the taxation of church property belonging to the Protestant or Catholic congregations remains as it was at and before the time of Mr. Covert's election. Ex-Mayor R.R. Herrick and Colonel Lewis Smith-Knight were the bosses of that ward at that time. I'm not sure that they were cognizant of the recount which was made in the absence of myself and my political friends. I was advised by many voters of all races to go to Columbus and contest the election of Mr. Covert, but I had neither time nor money to do so, and I let it drop, awaiting another opportunity to win promotion. During the 9 years of my service as Justice of the Peace, I also practiced law, principally in the criminal branch of the Court of Common Pleas, and in that sphere of action it was my good fortune to be confronted by some courteous and able attorneys who prosecuted for the state of Ohio. Amongst these were the late Homer B. DeWolf, William Robinson, S.M. Eddy, Peter H. Kaiser, Alex Haddon, Edward P. Slade, and last but not least our present Judge W. B. Neff, who for so many years has presided with learning and dignity in our Court of Common Pleas. The first murder case in which I defended in Cleveland was that of the State of Ohio versus Stephen Hood, charged with murder in the first degree in the premeditated killing of his foster son. Green, it was charged that early one spring morning, Hood took his 2 boys, Fred and Green, to the camping grounds from which a circus had just departed, ostensibly to search for lost money and other things of value. and that after searching for a short time he went into a neighboring wood, accompanied by Green, and pounded his head almost into jelly, and left the corpse there to be discovered later on by searchers for him. Hood professed innocence, and that he had no recollection of committing the deed, and the fact, which was not disputed, that Hood had adopted the boy, had always been kind to him, and even protected him when his wife would chastise him, left us all in doubt as to whether or not, if he did commit the act, he did it when in a rational condition. I adopted the defence of insanity, and proved, as I thought, that Hood was subject to hallucinations when his mind was unbalanced, and argued that if he did kill the boy, it was done when he was under the influence of one of these spells. William T. Clark, Esquire, then a young attorney, by my request came into the case to assist me, and very ably aided me in the entire defence. The late Judge R. F. Payne presided and conducted the case with his well-known judicial ability, fairness, and honor, while Mr. Homer B. DeWolf, young, energetic, learned, and able, prosecuted for the state. The trial lasted a number of days, and the court room was filled to the doors. Finally, the court having charged the jury, it retired in the afternoon, and remained out all night. On the following morning the foreman handed in a sealed verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. No sooner had the verdict been read and the jury polled than it became known that the jury, in its deliberations during the previous night, had made use of some law books which had been negligently left in the jury room, and that one of the jurors had assumed the role of judge, mounted the platform, and from the judge's bench had expounded the law. I should have said before that the jury was locked up in the court room to deliberate. We obtained the affidavits of several of the jurors establishing these facts, but owing to a decision rendered by our Supreme Court to the effect that the oath of a juror will not be received to impeach the verdict of his fellow jurors, the verdict was not set aside by Judge Payne. We took the case on error to the Supreme Court, but met with the same refusal, and that is the law of Ohio to this day. Failing to get any relief from any legal source, I went to Chillicothe, Ohio, where resided Governor Allen, sometimes called Foghorn, Bill Allen, in token of his stentorian voice, which waked the echoes amongst the hills of southern Ohio when he spoke at political gatherings many, many years ago. The governor had retired from active political life, but the exigencies of the Democratic party had called him forth from his beautiful and peaceful country home, Fruit Hill, which was nestled in the suburbs of Ohio's former capital, to do valiant service and once more reinstate his party and himself in power. The governor, a gentleman of the type and character of the days of Calhoun and Clay and Stanley, received me with all the indications of good breeding and gentility, and after thoroughly discussing the merits of the case, launched out into a sea of reminiscences of his congressional career, and did me the honor to state that he served in Congress and was well acquainted with the late Edward Stanley, mentioned in the first chapter, one of my reputed uncles. Upon the whole, my hour and a half was spent with pleasure and profit in the home of this distinguished statesman, and I left him the wiser for my visit to him, but without profit to my client. Hood had to die. I advised him and tried to nerve him for that horrid ordeal, and had the satisfaction of seeing him firm in step and every movement as he mounted and stood upon the trap of the gallows before he was launched into eternity. After the fall, a few shrugs and tremors of the swaying body were the only indications that it had any life in it, and in a few minutes the doctors pronounced him dead. I could never get from him a confession of the deed, and I believe that when he killed that unfortunate boy he was non-composements, not of sound mind. Many other men and women indicted for murder in the first and second degree I defended while I served as justice of the peace, but to even mention the cases briefly would tire the reader of this narrative, so I will desist. Later on it may be necessary to make reference to one or more of my experiences in order to bring to the front some of the public actors in the dramas, but until then let the foregoing suffice. While engaged as justice of the peace, it was my pleasure and indirectly my profit to make the acquaintance of a number of young gentlemen connected with the daily press of Cleveland, who afterwards become noted and in two instances at least famous as journalists. The first of these was the renowned Frank G. Carpenter, who has since, under the patronage more or less of presidents and other high officials of the United States and of royalty in Europe and Asia, traveled over the whole civilized world, and as a correspondent of syndicated newspapers and other publications contributed much towards the enlightenment of mankind. I recall Mr. Carpenter as a freckle-faced, diminutive young gentleman with an abundance of ruddy hair. He was then connected with the news department of the Cleveland Daily Leader, and in his quest of news items for his paper was the soul of energy and persistency. I for a long time looked forward to his daily calls, and did my bit in securing and furnishing to him whatever of interest I thought would be of value to him, and on more than one occasion he reciprocated the favor by making notice of me and my office in the Leader in a way that was of substantial benefit to me. Another young gentleman with whom I became much more familiarly acquainted was Mr. R. F. Payne, Jr., son of Judge R. F. Payne, the learned jurist who presided on the bench during the trial of Stephen Hood, of whose unfortunate ending I have just spoken. Mr. Payne represented one of the departments of the penny press, as the Cleveland press was then denominated, and it was largely through his indefatigable energy and skill that the press changed its name and became one of the great and influential papers of northern Ohio. He, too, in the commencement of his journalistic career, came regularly to my office in search of news items, and we all, justice, clerk, and constables, were pleased to accommodate him when practicable. In return for these alleged favors, Mr. Payne did us many favors in the way of advertising the office, which of course meant financial profit to us. I can never forget the large-heartedness of this gentleman when, years afterwards, as the managing editor of the press, he ran a conspicuous portrait of this writer on the front page of the press, gratis, which contributed substantially towards the election of the writer to a much higher and more honorable office than the one then held by him. And again, after my return from a trip in Ireland, he published a lengthy letter written by me, descriptive of my tour, in the press, and paid me handsomely for it. I may be excused for recording an interesting event connected with the penny press at the inception of its publication in Cleveland, which I think was the indirect cause of Mr. Payne's connection with that paper. There was a young man, since deceased, by the name of Maurice Perkins, who was connected with the news department of that paper from its inception here. Mr. Perkins was energy personified, and he could write a story which every one would stop to read. In one of the early editions appeared an article, quite readable, which greatly displeased a member of a great business firm of the city. A day or so later on, in pursuance of an invitation extended to him, Mr. Perkins visited the place of business of the aforesaid young gentleman, and while in there alone he received such treatment, in which tar played a conspicuous part, that he subsequently was confined to his bed, and his health was seriously impaired. I think it was about this time that Judge Payne was retained by the paper, and his talented son became one of its reportorial staff. Mention has already been made in the foregoing of a number of prominent attorneys at law who practiced occasionally in my office, but they were for the most part persons who were young in the profession at that time. Attention will now be called to several of riper years who were conspicuous for their learning and success, and as that Nestor of our bar, W.S. Carew-ish, Esquire, was in the same hall where my office was located, and only about 15 feet removed from it, I will first mention him. Mr. Carew-ish, then a man of middle age, and residing with his large and interesting family in Woodland Avenue, which was then a beautiful residence street, was a very active practitioner. He spoke the German language fairly well, and by reason of this fact brought into his office a clientele largely German. In the same hall, occupying an office contiguous to mine, was George A. Coble, Esquire, a justice of the peace, of many years' experience, who with a noble band of associates had literally escaped from Germany after the collapse of their attempted revolution, finding asylum and protection here in the United States. At the same time came Karl Schurz, Franz Siegel, Jacob Mueller, August Thiem, J. M. Schmidt, Esquire Bone, Edward Bum, and many others. I think they are all deceased now, but in their day they were all politically influential and did much to stimulate the study of the German language in our schools and to foster the love of their fatherland, which during the World War made so much inconvenience and trouble for some of their successors. Squire Colby was very fond of Mr. Kerrish for the reason that he spoke German, and exerted himself to add to the number of his clients in every practical way. I suspect also that there was a reciprocal feeling for the squire on the part of the able lawyer. Mr. Kerrish was cosmopolitan in his feelings and conduct. He was generous and liberal, and conceded to every man the right to the same enjoyment of all the constitutional rights which he and his enjoyed, without regard to race or color. I recall an anecdote which he has related to me on several occasions during the past 47 years of our acquaintance, which proved plainly the characteristics of the youth as developed in the man. He, with some of his classmates who were students at Western Reserve College when it was located at Hudson, Ohio, in the early 50s, extended an invitation to Frederick Douglass, who was then famous throughout land, for his eloquence and the strenuous fight he was making for the abolition of slavery in the United States, to address them in the big tent in the campus in Hudson on the annual occasion. The president and faculty demurred, and endeavored to persuade them to cancel the invitation, but they were obdurate, would not yield. As a consequence, at the appointed time, Mr. Douglass made his appearance, and in his own telling way addressed an immense throng, which completely filled the big tent. In answering an argument which was frequently put forth by the slaveholders and their northern friends, that one of the proofs of the Negro's inferiority was that he had a weak voice, Mr. Kerrish says that when he uttered that phrase, weak voice, he used the power of Gargantua, or roared like one of the bulls of Bashan. Mr. Kerrish derives great pleasure from the telling of this anecdote of his school days. During my official career as justice of the peace, an incident occurred which very forcibly displayed this characteristic of love of fair play is developed in Mr. Kerrish, which I will here record. Not feeling in the best of health, I went to the restaurant of the late Captain J. M. Richards, on the site of the present American Trust Building, of which I have already spoken, and was refused service of a meal because the enclosed stalls were occupied. I suggested to the usher that I was willing to eat at the outer table, where I saw numbers of young lawyers and others eating. The usher, Harm, I think they called him, said, "Oh, I can't seat a colored man at that table. The captain would raise the devil if I should do that." So with my heart bowed down and my stomach empty, I left the place and betook me to the office of that grand old patriarch, probate judge Daniel R. Tilden, who for more than 30 years was not only probate judge of Cuyahoga County, but was also a father to the fatherless and a very kind friend in need to those who called on him. I found sitting with him that John Marshall of our Ohio Constitution of 1851, the late Judge Rufus P. Ranney, who, as a member of the Supreme Court of Ohio, had made his name famous for all time for his legal learning, as seen in the constructions placed by him on that important document. I related to them my experience in the restaurant of Captain Richards, which greatly surprised and chagrined them both. "Why did Joe do that?" said Judge Ranney. "Is that a fact?" asked Judge Tilden. "Why, Dan," said Judge Ranney, "Green and my Charlie used to go to school together. From these good men I went to Kerrish. Green, he said, tomorrow we will go to that place, and if they refuse to seat and serve you, we will kick the table over, get arrested, and let the whole thing go before the people, that a justice of the peace of Cleveland cannot buy a meal in an ordinary restaurant." On the following day at noon, Kerrish and I went side by side to the same restaurant, fully determined to overturn the table if the justice were not served. When we entered, Harm, the usher, looked at us, drew a chair for each of us, and we both were politely and satisfactorily served according to our orders. My pleasure and relief were inexpressible, for as an officer of the peace I was loath to be arrested and fined for breaking the peace. Long live W.S. Kerrish! May his posterity practice his virtues and emulate his example. Judge Stephenson Burke was another of the fearless, frank practitioners at the Cleveland bar. The judge was well along in years in his professional career when he came to Cleveland. In the Lorain district he had been elected judge on his merits as an honorable man and good lawyer. He was serving on the bench during the exciting times precipitated by the Wellington rescue, when a large number of persons, citizens of Oberlin, including ministers of the gospel, professors in the college, lawyers, merchants, mechanics, and ordinary laborers, rushed to Wellington, 8 miles distant, forcibly took a fugitive slave from the custody of a United States marshal, and set him at liberty. They were arrested, brought to Cleveland, incarcerated, temporarily indicted, and ultimately brought to trial and convicted, several of them being ably defended by the late A.G. Riddle, Esquire, good lawyer, M.C., and author. Then it was that the grand jury of Lorain County, under the charge of Judge Burke, indicted the owner of the fugitive for kidnapping. When becoming aware of the fact, the owner returned to his Kentucky home, and the prosecutions on both sides were abandoned. Such was Judge Burke, and much more, for during the remainder of his long life after he came to Cleveland, he proved himself to be a great lawyer in the important affairs of big business. His name became associated with those of the great captains of industry and commerce of his day. He lived in princely style on our leading avenue, and dying left a generous competency to his sorrowing family. The late Edwin P. Slade, Esquire, and one-time prosecutor of Cuyahoga County, Ohio, is recalled with mingled feeling of joy and regret. Mr. Slade, brother of the late Albert T. Slade, who was noted for his legal and literary attainments, was naturally a noteworthy man, but by reason of the fascination the cup had over him, he was his own worst enemy. The name of his friends was Legion, not more for the reason that at times he would make a valorous fight to withstand the temptation than because of his high social and professional standing. As a final and last resort to help him to overcome his one seductive fault, he was elected prosecuting attorney of this populous and wealthy county, and paradoxical as it may seem, he prosecuted its criminal cases and conducted its business affairs in a sober, intelligent, praiseworthy manner. But once again out of office, he rapidly degenerated to his former condition. Staggering into my office occasionally, he would exclaim, "Oh, Brother Green, Brother Green!" Then, lapsing into silence for a few seconds, he would mumble out those well-known words of Cassius, "Drunk, and speak parrot, and squabble, swaggle, swear, and discourse fustian with one's own shadow. O thou invisible spirit of wine, if thou hast no name to be known by, let us call thee devil." Then, as if to add emphasis to the last 4 words, he would wag his head up and down, sorrowfully, pitifully. Ere long his flickering light went out. We all sighed over his bier, but submissively bowed to the decree of Providence. Judge W. A. Babcock, not so long deceased, was a conspicuous example of what a man, naturally endowed with an active, capacious brain, and educationally trained for activities in the higher walk of life, can do and be, if he wills to conquer. I met the judge when he was plain W. A. Babcock, an alumnus fresh from Hiram College, the very name of which, linked with that of the lamented J. A. Garfield, should be an inspiration to any man. The bright lights and seductive influences of the big city seemed at first to seal the fate of the young man, who really deserved a warmer reception and more wholesome environment than fell to his lot. If only some kindly hand had been stretched out for Will Babcock, which would have led him up to the Mount of Vision, where he could have beheld the honors which the future held in store for him, how different the first years of his career on this stage of action might have been. However, some of the greatest names that grace the pages of human endeavor have been, like him, tried as by fire, and like him have come through victorious. Judge Babcock, upon the whole, made an able and efficient judge. He was a voracious reader and a careful student of law, and his decisions carried weight with them wherever they were reviewed. The judge was also in almost constant demand for speeches and addresses which were not only instructive but entertaining as well. I met the judge near the middle of the public square on one occasion. He halted me and said abruptly, "Green, what is that quotation which you used in an argument the other day? I want to use it in an address tonight, something about making a scarecrow of the law." "Oh, yes, Judge," I answered. "It runs like this: we must not make a scarecrow of the law, setting it up to fear the birds of prey, and let it keep one shape till custom make it their perch and not their terror." Measure for Measure, Act 2, Scene 1. "Ah, yes," he exclaimed, "where is that found?" I told him, and he thanked me. Judge Babcock was an open-minded, free-hearted man. He had his failings, some of them quite glaring, but what human being is perfect? Once, after I had finished defending a man indicted for murder in the first degree, as soon as the jury retired, Judge Babcock leaned forward and said to me in open court, and the presence of many persons, "Green, the argument you made in this case to-day is the ablest I have listened to during the 8 years I've been on the bench." Surely this was praise, and the stimulus it imparted to me still impels me onward and upward, I trust. In the foregoing special mention has been made of the constabulary force connected with my office, but this sketch would be noticeably deficient were not the clerical force gratefully acknowledged. On succeeding and taking possession of the office furniture, dockets, and notarial seal of General David L. Wood, I found in possession, awaiting my advent, a very efficient clerk in the person of Mr. George Menger, who for years had faithfully served my predecessor in that capacity. I was pleased to learn from him that he was ready and willing to retain the same position and discharge the same functions as under D. L. Wood. For it must not be forgotten that when elected in 1873, I had little or no experience in practicing civil law before justices of the peace or in any other courts, and since Mr. Menger was expert in the technicalities of the business, it was in the nature of a godsend that he came to me. Mr. Menger was a German by birth, about 25 years of age, and quite festive in his proclivities, by which term I suppose I'm fairly well understood. In the office of Esquire George A. Colby there were 2 young men of German birth also, August Keel and Edward Belts, my name respectively, and they with Mr. Menger formed a trio which in social festivities was hard to beat. Mr. Keel was rather proud of his record of having drunk in one day 35 glasses of beer, while the 2 others were endeavouring to emulate his example, though I must state that of the 3 Mr. Belts was at all times comparatively conservative. One evening this writer joined them in a jolly meeting at the home of Mr. Menger's uncle in Marion Street, and after the feast and flow we repaired to the street, and in our meanderings ultimately found ourselves in the intersection of Erie, now East Ninth and Ohio, now Central Avenue, streets. It was past midnight, and we were quite hilarious, though not intoxicated, and we were at a loss as to how we could pass the remainder of the time agreeably. As there was an old horse straight in the street, we took turns in mounting and riding him bareback for a block or 2 and back again. At length, in the wee small hours, we repaired to our several homes, where we for a few short hours became oblivious of the past and careless as to the future. Mr. Edward Belts was a gentleman of culture and industry. Under the instruction of Esquire Colby, he entered upon the copying of records in the county recorder's office pertaining to real estate, and continued in one phase and another of that business until he had laid the foundation of a great abstract company, which I consider the most fitting monument to his industry and skill during his long life. The other men died in comparative youth, and today I am the only one of that nocturnal quartet left to tell the tale. Mr. Lyndon C. White, a genial, efficient young man, succeeded to the duties of Mr. Menger. Mr. White's health was poor, which necessitated frequent absences from his desk. On such occasions Mr. Lewis W. Turner, a gentleman of color, very ably filled the interim. Mr. Turner was subsequently elected one of the constables of Cleveland Township, which position he ably filled in my office and that of others. Mr. White died in his youth, sincerely mourned by many friends. The last clerk whom it was my good fortune to employ was Mr. George P. Phibbs, a native of Ireland, who had been discovered by my colored constable, Mr. Parker Hare. Mr. Phibbs gave up the business of barkeeper for a man by the name of Connor or Connors, whose establishment was located on the northeast corner of Michigan Avenue and West 3rd Street. His writing was like copperplate, and his spelling and diction gave evidence of the fact that he had enjoyed reasonable education facilities. After acting as an assistant to Mr. Hare for some few months, he consented to enter my employ as clerk, and from that time on, for about 10 years, we were almost inseparable. He was truly my Fidus Achates, and by his industry and influence amongst the Irish people, especially along business and political lines, he added very materially to my official and political successes. On one occasion, when I apprehended defeat at the polls, by his untiring energy and influence he caused me to run ahead of the ticket in 2 Democratic wards, the Bloody 5th and the Rock-bound 8th, although I was denominated a black Republican. After I ceased to perform the functions of justice of the peace, Mr. Phibbs and I became partners in the practising of law, he having on my certificate been admitted to the bar. Mr. Phibbs and I inducted Squire William R. Ryan, subsequently sheriff of Cuyahoga County, Ohio, into the mysteries of his office when he was elected justice of the peace of Cleveland Township, and a little later on in life he stood as godfather to ex-sheriff W.G. Smith of the same county when an infant he was christened. On one occasion, while still in the employ of my office, he visited his old home, Ireland. On returning, he brought and presented to me a beautiful black thorn cane, and in return for the favour, later on, in one of my European trips, I made a detour and visit to the old sod, and even kissed the Blarney Stone, through the courtesy of some tourists, who held me head downwards from the parapet until I performed the osculatory feat. From Cleveland, Mr. Phibbs went to Pomona, California, removing from there to Los Angeles, where for a time he was assistant county or city prosecutor. Later on he became interested in the manufacture of a cereal breakfast food, and became wealthy. He died a decade ago, and I have left only the delightful memory of a man whom I consider my best friend, next to my dear mother, sisters, and my family. Speaking of my Irish friend brings to my mind the fact that Mr. Michael Gallagher, a giant in stature and one time marshal of the city or town of Cleveland, used often to honour us with presents, and occasionally served writs for us. Mike Gallagher was a genial, whole-souled fellow, full of reminiscences of the early days of the city, and withal companionable and helpful. He, too, has crossed the great divide. Looking backwards over my career as a justice of the peace, I think the most humorous episode that occurred in my office was the following. Mr. Discott Evans, who for many years was noted as being perhaps the most skilful portrait painter in this section of the United States, and who with his beautiful and talented daughter were lost in mid-ocean when a great French liner foundered, on their return trip from Paris, where he had spent some time in perfecting himself in the art of delineating laces and draperies, he was also something of a wag as well. On one occasion, seeing a picturesque little coloured newsie on the avenue, whose appearance attracted his notice, he offered to compensate him if he would come into his studio and not pose, but submit to some decoration. The boy consented, and once in the studio, Mr. Evans painted his nose a bright vermilion hue, streaked his forehead and cheeks more or less with the same, and sent him into an adjoining room, tenanted by a lady, lover of art, to deliver to her a note which, apropos, the artist had written and given to him. The note ran somewhat as follows: "Dear Miss, knowing you to be fond of natural subjects, I send you herewith one on foot. He has a pedigree," etc., etc., etc. The boy, instead of delivering the note, as he was paid to do, carried it home to his mother, who, being strongly saturated with Indian blood, went on the war-path, so to speak, which led to the office of the late J.B. McLaughlin, Esquire, an attorney at law, who immediately came to my office and sued the artist for $300 damages sustained by the boy by reason of the malicious decorations which he had inflicted on him. Mr. Evans, being duly summoned, appeared in court with his lawyer, John J. Curran, Esquire, and demanded a trial by jury, which being granted, the case was in due course formally tried. Strange to relate, the jury returned a verdict for the plaintiff in the sum of $100. The defendant, of course, was both surprised and shocked at the result, and gave notice of appeal, but before the lapse of the 10 days limit for appeal, the parties settled the case by defendant paying to plaintiff the sum of $25 and the costs of suit, all amounting to about $40. In the absence of more important news to print, many papers in the United States carried a story of this case, even beyond the Mississippi River, one of them finishing its account as follows: Lawyer McLaughlin, in arguing the case, created a profound sensation in court by the startling definition he gave to the term pedigree. Another case, which I have never forgotten, was one of embezzlement brought by the Wilson Sewing Machine Company, in which the complainant, Muck Bunnell by name, was declared to have appropriated to his own use the sum of $500 belonging to his employer. This case lasted 2 days. Henry C. White, Esquire, subsequently probate judge of the county, represented the defendant. 14 witnesses for the state testified to the identity of the defendant, and he was bound over to await the action of the grand jury, but it was subsequently ascertained that the defendant was not Muck Bunnell, and the company settled with him for his wrongful arrest, imprisonment, and prosecution by paying him $500 in cash. End of chapter 7.